Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Strafford, Mike Palmer along with you. And on today's episode, we wanted to take a step back and look at all of the craziness going on in the world right now. And by that, I mean, how do we find proper places to learn when there's so much noise out there? How do we weed through all of the different sources we can get and find the actual facts of a matter? And how do we educate ourselves on the things going on in the world each and every day, scientifically, and so on? Mike, how are you doing?
So considering the noise, Nate Silver wrote a wonderful book a couple years ago called The Signal and the Noise. I understand half of that these days, which is the noise. I'm trying to discern where the signals are. And then I'm also trying to find quiet in the noise to allow me to reflect and try to assimilate and understand what's going on. And that can be really hard when you're also trying to stay connected to the spirit of the times and consume a lot of the media that's coming out nowadays. So I think it's complicated, obviously. And, I think we as a podcast try to stay in safe places. And I think try to steer clear of being political, try to steer clear of triggering ourselves or others by anything that we talk about. And I think that's very much the mindset that I think we're adopting as we try to wade into some of this. But in light of the political context in the U.S. these days, as a trend spotting show, we can't keep our head in the ground around the fact that we're heading into an impeachment inquiry, and we may actually head into an impeachment in the U.S.
Right.
And that's at a time that similar stuff is happening in the U.K. around Brexit. The whole geopolitical universe that we're living in is very topsy-turvy nowadays. And I think there's a few natural reactions that may be that may come out of that. One is to focus on other stuff. So the avoidant angle, which I certainly have fallen prey to, although sadly the New York Mets are now eliminated from the postseason, so that's no longer a diversion for me. But finding those safe diversions, golden age of media is wonderful, something you could certainly spend really the entirety of your time on. Just saw The Dark Crystal, watched that, which I loved. I'm a big fan of Jim Henson, everything he did back in the day. That's on Netflix. You want some escapism, I'd recommend The Dark Crystal for those who like puppets and dystopic alternative universes. That was entertaining. Also got out for my wife's first birthday since we had our son Matthew, and we were able to see a movie for the first time in the last 2 years. And we saw Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez, also zeitgeisty in its own way, and it was choice between Hustlers and Downton Abbey.
Sure.
And I think I married well in that Robin, my better half, was happy to explore what was pretty entertaining couple hours around Hustlers. But when not avoiding what's going on, when you want to understand how do I make sense of what's happening, I thought that was a really relevant conversation for a learning and education podcast.
Yep.
We might not have all the answers, but we could at least begin to explore the questions and just recognize that the world is going to be different as we head into this next phase in the U.S. and try to begin to forecast that and maybe curate for folks where you might find relevant information is something we could at least begin to talk about, and then figure out how often we want to come back to these topics. But it was too big a thing to happen to not cover.
Right.
So we thought we'd at least kick it a little here, Dan. So we're kicking it, right?
Well, I think multiple things you said were equally intriguing. One, we can take this from a historical perspective. We can take it from a civics. We talked before we started recording about civics and civics education, civic
Yep.
engagement. We've talked to a good friend of the show, Mark Sanders, in the past about civics and civics on the college campus.
Dr. Mark Sanders.
That's exactly right. And then we can just deal with the idea of, and I don't know if this plays really as an analogy, but we talk all the time about spaced repetition and understanding learning as spaced repetition, learning something, moving on to something else, coming back to it again. The 24-hour news cycle in Twitter and Facebook sort of throws impeachment in our face if you're engaged with those platforms all the time. There is no break. There is no time to step away and process what you heard or process what you read or what you saw. And so I don't know that as a way to get information, the constant digest of social media coupled with this topic is going to engage and educate people in any way. And so how do we find that time to take the sources we trust, read them, and then step away? To your point, find those safe things, the things that you want to get away with: sports, books, movies, whatever it might be, family, whatever it might be that you want to go to. And is that the best way to approach it now? Sort of engage when you feel up to it and then step back and find solace in other things, I think is a really interesting topic too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it reminds me of the show we did on, is Twitter making us dumber?
Exactly right.
And I think the answer was probably. Like the number of tweets generated by the impending political crisis in the U.S. Is off the charts. It's blowing up my feed, and to the point where I'm I think I mentioned on the show how I've deleted my Facebook account. I'm questioning the value of engaging through Twitter right now. I think I might just want to put it on timeout for a little, and get a little more intentional about, I'm going to spend a half hour on Twitter each day or each week, or get some sort of structure to that engagement. Reminds me also of the problem of notifications,
right?
Where like if you're constantly interrupted by things that are news like, or this just in, it's like the whole trope of like CNN always has the red like
breaking
news.
Yep.
And if there's always breaking news, you never have time to reflect as long as you have the news on. So I think that would argue for, turning the news off.
Yep.
And then also arguably more of a journalistic sensibility around what is actually news and what is actually an emergency. Because like it reminds me of the, fight or flight is only supposed to be activated in crisis situations. And we've evolved for those crises to hit and then go away.
Yep.
And if you're constantly in a crisis mode, you will never have time to reflect. You'll never have time to kind of think long term about your perspectives. And I am honestly struggling with this. And at the same time, to your point about family, like, as a new dad, like one of my outlets is I can spend time with now he's 9 months old. I can spend time with my son. And like, if I didn't have my son, I'd probably be traveling more, but I would be doing things that were specifically not plugged in.
Yep.
Because I don't know how much benefit you have in understanding in real time what's developing. Like I actually think a little bit of like, when newspapers were printed every day, you would have a day to process what had just come in.
Absolutely.
And then you would have the next day you could go through that same cycle again. And then the news agencies, the newspapers and other journalistic endeavors would have a day to synthesize and then say, we can only fit so much stuff into what we want to share with you. Here's what it is. That's all kind of upside down nowadays, where like you don't only, in addition to the news being so 24/7, there's also the takes on the news
Right.
that are also 24/7 in multiple channels. So like, I'll dial it back because I'm a little wound up right now. I need to just find my safe
Well,
place.
I think you're hitting on. I was going to go a different angle where we're talking about 24-hour news cycles, and I do genuinely believe they are not good as a regular watch.
Mhm.
If there's a specific program that you tune into or something, but keeping that on all day, to your point, is always ramping up that something's happening.
Yeah.
That something in the world is breaking news. Something is happening, and
You run out of cortisol. Like your glands start saying, "There's only so much adrenaline I can feed you. I got nothing for you."
So then you either get doled to it, right? And
Yep.
so it never doesn't matter anymore, or you're constantly anxious and up. But what I was going to liken it to, you said the newspapers, was the old school news broadcasts at
Yep.
11 o'clock at night, where
Mhm.
again, and take this from me as a personal opinion about the news. I worked in news. I was a reporter for a little while. You either or someone who right now trusts the media or doesn't. And I will say this from an education standpoint, that as you watch the news, you believed they were there to provide information to you, and they were doing their best to provide content to you that was good. Now it's entertainment. The 24-hour news cycle is an entertainment factor. And so they want you to stay watching. And so if I could break away and not watch a CNN and MSNBC or Fox News and focus again on a really good hourly news show every night, to your point about the newspapers, I feel the same, that I'd be able to get my information, step away, digest it, learn from it, and then move forward. And I think the interesting thing, again, to go back to social media, and I have admitted on this show before that I am on Twitter too much. Like I'm trying to dial back on, especially with my kids, shutting off notifications, staying away from the phone, staying away from the computer. But what's interesting there is, one, obviously there is real fake news on there. There are people who are spreading misinformation all the time.
Mhm.
But the timeline aspect of it all, right? The idea that I may have posted something 4 hours ago that was breaking news at the time. But if you then logged on right now and you retweeted that or reshared it into someone's timeline, now they're getting information that is old for the breaking news aspect of it, that they already might have new information on, but they're trying to process both. You're
Mhm.
trying to process the timeline of everything while doing it live, to your point,
Mhm.
staying constantly on top of it. I just don't know that our brains are coded that way
Yeah.
to be able to process all of those things all at the same time and come away having learned something. We may
Right.
process it. We may be able to have emotions about it and have a surface reaction, but I don't know that we're learning
Right.
and absorbing and then being able to apply that to a later task or a
Right.
news bite that comes through.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I mean, like, I think finding a safe place to learn is something that's been resonating with me lately. So, like, I may have mentioned, like, my first job out of college was working in child and adolescent psych, so crisis stabilization unit, and our job was to provide a safe place provide a safe environment to kids who are in crisis. And I think increasingly, when you think about learning, getting back to the whole fight or flight idea, when you're in a fight or flight mode, you're not really learning, you're executing. So like you're probably operating at more of like a reptile brain level, not the level of the brain that typically learns. And like a lot of those reactions are either instinctive or they're burned in based on prior knowledge, prior experience, and they're more emotional. So like it's more of it's a reactive mode. And I think learning typically is when you are able to shift your mindset to actually develop new subroutines.
Right.
You know, it's sort of, Daniel Kahneman wrote the famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So like when you're thinking fast, it's more emotional, it's more in the moment, it's more reactive. And when you're more deliberative about your thought is when you're actually developing new ideas and sort of evolving and getting better, hopefully. And I think when there's so much news, there's so much noise, it's more likely to be in that fast twitch.
Yep.
Did I respond fast enough? Did I retweet this? Did I like this tweet? Did I, share something that is relevant and new? in a way that maybe other people in my network haven't done yet. And there's some aspect of credibility you get by being on something when it's first emerging, but you're not really learning. It reminds me of even in chat, like we do a lot of live online for Kaplan. So like when we do chats, like, there's this desire to be the first person with the right answer in the chat. And if you're the first person to do something, you suddenly have some relevance. And then when news is breaking, who got the scoop and who shared the article first? And, if speed is the dimension that we're all chasing to be relevant, that's going to just create a ton of noise where everybody's going to be trying to be first, share it out first. Everybody's going to be sharing the same information multiple times. But the more reflective component, the thing that takes a little time to mature, even honestly, formats like podcasts, conversational formats, they struggle with the complexity and they allow for some time to reflect. Part of why I've been very grateful for the opportunity to have this show is that it gives me time to collect my thoughts and actually have my own perspective on things. And maybe I would have gotten here if I didn't have something structured to force me to do this every week. But the fact that I'm forced to do this every week makes me adopt tactics that are different than if I was only on social media, only trying to be relevant. Like I am forced to spend time to pull back and think through, okay, what would I curate?
Right.
What would I organize to stay relevant? And then particularly the trending part forces you to wade into the sort of the eye of the hurricane to a certain extent, where like this stuff emerges, it becomes a huge deal. And if we don't engage, we're speaking by our silence, So like, I think the fact that we may be heading into like a constitutional crisis in the US. So like, I'd like to spend a little more time on what impeachment is.
Yep.
Just so that folks can come away from this show with a little more knowledge. So like, this is the part of the show where like we go to Google for you and we read off of Wikipedia for you. But honestly, that's a service. Like everybody's time is limited, and the idea of being smart about curating content and providing relevant information, I think is an increasingly valuable service to provide. So like, to me, this speaks to for just like every citizen in the US, arguably in the world, should probably be brushing up on the Constitution, should be brushing up on US history, and should be understanding what can a citizen, assuming you're not a legislator,
right,
you don't have a public office, what can and should you do to understand what's happening today, and then to ideally, A, protect your own sanity, and then B, ideally provide some clarity to others, whether you have friends or family who may be struggling. How do we navigate all this? So since we have this platform, I thought it was a useful time for us to, ideally in a non-political way, to just try to assess where are we and what might it mean.
Yep.
And then where should people go if they want to learn more? So hopefully, we're just, this is breaking news.
There it is.
But like we could at least begin that conversation, and then probably kick it off to I don't think these topics are going to go away, so we'll want to continue to cover them.
Yeah, and we will also be able to over time bring people in, experts in fields across these different topics. I think civics is one we'll probably put a pin in for now. We do have Mark, who was a great guest before, and there are a couple of really good articles from the Brookings Institute around civics education and the principles that should be involved in civics education that we can dive into at a different time. But the idea here, one, non-politically and looking historically at impeachment, the idea of the process of And I think this is where people are right now getting confused around what's happening right now
Mhm.
in the House. Impeachment has stages to it. It's not something that is just called for and done. Impeachment goes through a variety of stages. There's currently the beginning of an impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives for the United States, where they are starting to investigate what they think may be high crimes and misdemeanors. That's part of the Constitution that leads to impeachment proceedings by the President of the United States. And so that may lead to then articles of impeachment that are voted on by the lower house. It needs a simple majority. That then moves to the Senate, and the Senate holds the trial. And the Senate would hold the trial where they basically have a open trial for the impeachment proceedings, and then they vote to convict or to not convict.
Mhm.
And in historical sense, Mike, we've seen this with Andrew Johnson. We've seen this with Bill Clinton, and we saw it with Richard Nixon. Obviously, Nixon retired. That was a very nice way to say how Nixon left office. Nixon retired, resigned, of course, before impeachment proceedings went fully through. So
Mhm.
that's kind of where we're at right now.
And just to clarify too, Clinton was impeached in the House,
Correct.
and then was not impeached in the Senate,
He was
right?
not guilty of the crimes he was charged with in the Senate.
Right. And then Andrew Johnson, historically was like, where did his impeachment, was he fully, because like we haven't really had a full Monty impeachment as far as
Correct.
I'm concerned, right? Like,
Correct.
so I don't know if I guess I am concerned. So as far as I'm concerned, but even Johnson wound up, he resigned as well, right? So like we haven't gone through the full process that's outlined in the Constitution, really in any of these cases. So like Andrew Johnson left office, right? He resigned, I believe.
So it was, I should have clarified, it's 2/3, and this I did just look up, 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict.
Right.
So for Johnson, he received 35 votes for guilty, 19 for not guilty, and
Mhm.
35 senators voting guilty and 19 not guilty every time the vote went to pass. And then he did a step down. I don't know specifically the timing
Yep.
of when he did, but he left office. And this is during Reconstruction. It's during, obviously turbulent times.
Right.
in the
Imagine what the
United States.
podcasts were like back then.
Well, but we should go back to the fake news and the news cycle probably for a separate discussion, maybe bring in a journalist or an expert in the field, because I do find it an intriguing thought process to think through. Breaking news in 1850 moved at a certain speed,
Yeah.
and breaking news today moves at a certain speed. Are they in line with the times?
Right.
Like, does it still move with the information, or are we moving at a much more rapid pace
Right.
today?
Did Moore's law contemplate the rate at which a pony
Exactly right.
on the express can get the information out there,
Right.
versus now it's instant. Yeah.
So that is the sort of general sense of impeachment. Now, this can happen to pretty much any civil servant or elected official. It doesn't have to
Yep.
be president. It can be an attorney general. It can be a governor. It can be a state senator. All of them can go through this impeachment process
Yeah.
to try to remove them from office.
Right. And it's also a nice vocabulary word. To impeach is to like besmirch
Yes.
or to sully. All lovely words. We love our vocabulary on the show. But so thus far, no one has actually gone through the entirety of the process as outlined in the Constitution,
Correct.
which also arguably, this is where I'd love to get more folks with legal experience and legal chops in as experts. But arguably, what's outlined in the Constitution may be too high a bar. If in the approaching 300 years, say 250 years in which our republic's been around, this is the fourth time we're going through this exercise. Twice this has resulted in a resignation. Once it was in a not guilty, and Clinton served the entirety of his term, and now this is the fourth time. At what point can we go back to the drawing board and begin to understand whether the Constitution fully accounted for the complexity that we're facing?
Sure.
I think that's an interesting question on the legal side. It's an interesting question on the political side. Um, and I'm not sure we really know how this is going to play out, but I would say, like, if you're interested in a career in the legal profession, if you're interested in a political science career, yeah, honestly, if you just want to stay informed, vote effectively, and raise a family who can do similarly, there is a level of passing awareness. It reminds me when we were talking about the Gartner hype cycle, like there's a level of awareness of the Constitution that every citizen in the US should have, much like anyone who wants to stay employed in the next 10 to 15 years should understand why the blockchain is interesting or why AI and automation may be disrupting work. So like learning is a hugely relevant activity. And I think applying that learning to help provide clarity in a time of noise and confusion, I think is something folks will be seeking. And then I think if we could help curate a little bit of this without becoming a politics show, like just, Rohit, who we refer to frequently, talks about one of the trends he identified a couple years ago is the one of manipulated outrage. Yep. So like there is a level, of performative outrage. Let me signal to everyone I know through my social networks and elsewhere that I'm upset and that I'm outraged, and reinforce this through social channels when I share it is a very natural instinct. I just think that instinct may be damaging. So how do we tap into a higher level of professional and personal development in a time when the world is increasingly chaotic? Yeah, go ahead.
I just think that as you were talking through the idea of us curating, right? And you were talking about your own approach to trying to stay off social, that sort of thing, talking through it here on the podcast. Do you have sources for news or for education right now that you go to? And this isn't necessarily saying that this is where other people should go, but do you have a sense of where you feel most comfortable getting? You don't have to name the sources, but do you have this sort of list that you're getting together to feel like you're comfortable with what you're learning and where you're getting it from?
I think it's hard to get personal about it because the sources feel polarized nowadays. Yep. So like without sharing too much of my own personal preferences, where I go to find the truth is likely going to be questioned by people who might have a different political background than I do. And like, I think that is the thing to explore. Like, where are there safe places to learn and safe places to disagree? Right. And one thing we maybe haven't done a good enough job on, although I think we're starting to, get our feet wet a little bit, is exploring more complicated topics where our guest's perspective may be different than our own, and doing that in a way that is still ultimately a bettering conversation. And then also like demonstrating that people who may not have the same perspective are able to talk to each other and listen to each other, is, I think, increasingly relevant as well. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the Constitution's a good place to go.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Like just go to the primary sources. Like, I'll full disclose, I did not read the Mueller report. I did read the entirety of this memo. What I haven't done yet, but it's on my list, and we talked about it as well. You were talking earlier, Dan, about whistleblower is now trending. So like there are laws around protecting whistleblowers that are increasingly relevant. So if we were to search for that, what are some relevant ways to understand that? I still think actually reading the law itself, and hopefully we can find enough of that is digestible so that you don't have to get a TLDR version of the Constitution or a too long didn't read version of the whistleblower laws. But the idea that those laws are in place and they're in place specifically for some of the things that we're encountering today, although the reality is we're kind of off script as well. So like we're now in places where, you know, the law is anticipatory and reactive. So at best it's anticipatory, most likely it's reacting. So like what just happened? How do we settle it so that if something like this happens again, we have some precedent to refer back to?
Yep.
Best case, our legislators anticipate where the problems are going to emerge, so they put something out there. That's really what the Constitution was trying to do. And then frequently what happens is like what you anticipated, you maybe get 60% right, and then the other 40% is where the law is evolving and is a living experience that needs to be rewritten. I think that's really where we are now, and that's why hopefully folks don't get too frustrated with this show as a bit of a tease, but like it does seem enormously relevant to the collective mindset, at least in the US and probably globally, that this stuff is going to inform people's career choices.
Right.
It's going to inform the job market, the economy, the certainly 2020, which is on the horizon. So had we not decided to cover it, I think that would have been more problematic than wading in with maybe not fully formed understandings of what's the right perspective. But like if you think about it, maybe last point, if you think about it from the perspective of learning and education, all of these things, you know, as much as it might seem a little too pat on the nose and simple, all these things argue for increased focus on education, like learn more. Like if you don't learn more, you will be ceding your autonomy and your power to others who probably don't know more than you. So like if anything, all of this chaos argues for finding that quiet place where you can learn new things, and then ideally having opportunities to engage in the conversation once you've had that time to learn, and then maybe making intentional choices about where you want to have that conversation. Like, do you want to have it on Twitter? Do you want to have it on Facebook? Do you want to call an old friend? Like, do you want to talk to your family? Do you have a community of practice, a network, like a personal learning network we've talked about in the past, where like, you know, in some ways this show is like a microcosm of a personal learning network. Like we're figuring stuff out as we go. Can people out in the world find that not just through outlets like this, but in their own lives where they can find people they trust and just grapple with some of the complexity that we're facing? I wish there was an easier way to put a bow on top of all this. I don't know if you have a way to do that, Dan, in which case, please go forth and present a wonderful bow.
I will do it by singing your praises. I asked you that question and you answered better than I even thought you would have. Where do you go? The primary sources matter so much right now. And reading things for yourself and being able to digest, even if they're out of scope for what you know, learn it. And we've seen a lot. You shared an article about reading and understanding novels and books, and it comes back a lot more to not about knowing what the topic is, but having enough experience in that topic to then understand the book. And so if you don't have any constitutional law background, work by reading the Constitution and start there and start by learning the primary sources. And I'm guilty of this a lot. Don't let other people do the work for you.
Right.
Don't expect to go to Twitter and learn from the experts out there. Do a little bit of the heavy lifting yourself, and you'll, one, be able to have those conversations, but two, you'll then have that scaffolding, where you can build from to learn more and understand more
Yeah.
as you go forward.
Yeah. And I just to kind of put a cherry on top of your bow, because it's a Sunday with a bow on top and a cherry on top of the bow. But like to do all that, I would say like we should spend a little more time looking for like independent entities that have a fair perspective. So like since we have a platform here, where would we encourage people to look? Like as an example, based on a recent show that we just did, the whole idea of digital inclusion is something that I think struck a nerve with us. We thought that was a relevant conversation. If it is partisan, I think we're fine being on the partisan side that says more people should have access to technology that gives them access to opportunity. I think there are places where we can, in fact, say where we can curate and we can recommend. I just think when it becomes politically charged, that's a place where we're trying to be specifically nonpartisan. So like, I think it gets a little harder, but I think that's on us to figure out where can we do a little more of that curation, because there are people who are earnestly pursuing the truth. Like even the courage of whistleblowers, assuming that they're whistleblowing against something that should be called out, that's a courageous position. And I think we need to figure out how to encourage that courage in all of us, because it's a time where when you see that no one, like it's the whole bystander problem. Like if you don't speak up, there's a chance that no one will, and the stakes of no one speaking up are increasingly high. So like, I think it's an area for us to continue to explore. We'd love to get more feedback too. Like if any of our listeners have recommendations in terms of like sort of impartial places to look. Also, like as tedious as it might be, like C-SPAN and
Absolutely.
just watching the political process that we have play forward to get your own perspective. To your point, Dan, like if you have the time, watching the entirety of it is useful. I think, you know, we had Gene Ellen Cowgill from TikTok on Twitter recently. They're useful for me personally in that they provide the short form digestible version of something that I might not have as much time to. I might not be able to spend the whole day watching congressional briefings. But I'd say like it is a time to think about your sources, think about how you consume information, and ideally, you know, continue to engage with us in this conversation because it's something that we're all grappling with.
The other bow or cherry, whichever we're using at present, I want to put on is I've used this podcast that you were talking about, your sort of process to learn myself and to understand things and talk through things. And that is a lot of what podcasting can be for some is the ability to talk through and discuss and be able to say things that are challenged or accepted and grow that way. So talking through this today and what we can make here as a podcast and also what we can do individually, I think was a big help for me as well. I think my big takeaway is put down the phone, Dan. That's first and foremost. But secondarily is how to curate better and how to share that curation. To your point,
Right.
like, go forth and share because you are learning something. And I think that's a key takeaway for me as well. Obviously, a topic and topics we will come back to historically, politically, civically, lots of things to take from this episode and go forward with. We're going to start reaching out to some guests. Mike said, if you have any curation tips or where you're reaching out, if you have any guests or people you would want us to talk to here on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you as well on that. Of course, it's at Trending on Twitter. Same on Facebook. Find us on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/trendingineducation. And of course, it's trendingineducation.com. Each and every week, you can find us there. So we hope this was engaging. We hope it was a conversation that you want to keep going in the future. And until next time, you've been listening to Trending in Education.